All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether it's your afternoon or your morning. My name is Amy Meyer, and I am a program manager at World Resources Institute, and I lead our work at the nexus of the private sector and climate policy. I'm really excited to be hosting you all and our amazing speakers today, not only because this marks a major milestone in a line of work that I am incredibly passionate about and have been working on for the past several years now, but also because this is really a incredibly timely moment. We have members of Congress and other political leaders debating climate policy right now. In Congress, so this could not come at a better time to really be engaging. As a quick logistical note, I invite all of you to please, if you have questions, to put those in the Q&A chat box that can be found at the bottom of your screen. I will try and reserve 10 minutes at the end for a dedicated Q&A session. However, I will kind of monitor that throughout and try and sprinkle those in case time gets away from us. So please do take advantage of that function. And I'll say that for myself, if there's one thing that I hope you all leave here with in an hour, it's clear next steps on how you and your organization can best champion climate policy in the United States. Whether you're a company or an NGO or an investor or just a random person who's wandered into this webinar, really hoping to give you those concrete steps to come away with. So what are we here talking about today? Haley, if you want to go to the next slide, you'll see here just a small smattering of headlines that have recently been in the news as it relates to how companies exercise their political influence when it comes to climate change. And you'll see from kind of the range here, there's increasing numbers of stakeholders who are really paying attention to this and who are calling for action. The tension that is at play is that companies and the private sector as a whole has been doing a fairly good job. We've seen a lot of improvement when it comes to setting internal goals for climate change. We've seen a huge increase in companies setting science-based targets, some really notable announcements about going net zero, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. These are big announcements, and companies are pushing change through their own internal operations and through their supply chains in some cases. And while this is all great, it is not a substitute for having a economy-wide, a national public climate policy regime. We really need policy in place, not only to make sure that everyone is moving at the pace and the scale needed, but also to develop the right technologies, to have the right incentives in place to really get the infrastructure that will enable some of the revolutions in energy that we need to see. And right now, a lot of companies are either not engaging politically when it comes to climate change. It's not something that they are big lobbyists on. But even more dangerous is those companies who either intentionally or unintentionally are actually working against climate policy being enacted. Companies that are directly lobbying or maybe indirectly lobbying, but are contributing to this dynamic in Congress where climate change policy has stalled out and isn't going anywhere. If you go to the next slide, Haley. WRI, it might be hard to see on the screen, but we helped found alongside 10 of our peer NGOs this coalition known as the AAA Framework for Corporate Climate Leadership. And the screenshot here just shows this ad that we placed in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, written from the CEOs of our organizations to the CEOs of corporate America. This open letter really calling on them to take advantage of this moment with a new administration coming in and climate change on the agenda to start practicing science-based science-aligned climate policy advocacy, really call for changes here to make their voices heard and to get something done, so that it's easier to accomplish their own goals and to take care of the world we all inhabit. So this is something that we've been working on, and hopefully, for many of you, this might be the first time you've encountered this topic, but hopefully, with all the conversation that's been floating around, this is just one more note in a long drumbeat that many of you are hearing. This call to action to really step up and become better climate policy advocates. If you go to the next slide, Haley, I just want to be clear up front that, I'll be throwing around the term political influence or climate advocacy, and wanted to just show the breadth of what I'm talking about here and what our speakers will be talking about. So it's not just lobbying, although that is a major component, but there are many other ways that corporations in the United States exercise political power. So you can see, campaign donations, donating to foundations or being part of trade associations, even marketing activities, all kind of fall under this bucket. So just wanted to have that front and center for you all. And as another quick point, I will be speaking today, and I believe most of the speakers will as well, though they'll correct me if I'm wrong. Speaking from a US perspective, that is where this research that WRI has done really centers, just given the unique relationship between the government and our political system and the goals we're trying to accomplish on the policy side. So just making that note up front so there's no confusion. So before I bring in our amazing speakers, I wanted to just take a moment to orient everyone to some of the findings of WRI's recent research. This is a paper that came out about 2 weeks ago now that myself and my colleague Elliot Metzger led on. And you can see this graphic on the screen now. And this is a great summary of the findings of the paper. And we're going to use these barriers that you can see as sort of a guide for conversation throughout. So wanted to just take a moment to quickly explain what these barriers are before we open things up to discussion with the speakers. So you can see on the left-hand side these purple circles showing drivers for why a company might want to engage on climate policy. And while there's a lot of outside pressure coming from investors and customers and employees, there's also a very strong business case for why a company would want to engage on policy. It can really be a big risk and cost reduction. It can help with reputation. It helps companies to meet the goals that they've set for themselves by having this level playing field and having everyone moving, continuing to move forward with them. So the question we asked in this research was, if we have this strong business case and all this outside pressure, why are we seeing so many companies struggle to align their sustainability goals, their climate goals, with their lobbying activity? There are some companies who are stepping up and who've been leading in this space, but many more companies have been struggling in this area or haven't had it on their radar at all. So we asked this question following the theory of change that if you understand what the barriers are, you can better design the solutions and the strategies for moving past them. So we dove into that and came up with these 7 barriers you can see in the little honeycomb on the graphic, and they're organized into 3 parts. In the upper left are barriers that relate to organization and strategy, and these are ones that are internal to a firm, more or less, that they have control over. The first is the org chart, how a company is organized, who reports to whom, what their directives are, what their incentives are, how that dynamic plays out and how companies are actually organized. We found this to be a very big barrier. The second, competing priorities. Believe it or not, climate change is not every company's top priority, although many of us may wish that that weren't the case. But there are other things that companies care about. Trade and taxes are big ones here, as well as many industry-specific topics. And when companies feel that they have limited resources or limited political capital, climate is jockeying with some other topics to really rise to the top there and get the attention it needs. And this can relate to the knowledge gap as well, where I mentioned taxes are a big topic that most companies care about. And for your average company is going to have a team of lobbyists who are experts at taxes and on trade, who know how to navigate that space on the Hill, through Congress, with politicians. They're really experts at that. But on climate change, we haven't quite seen the same resources being invested, and there is this disconnect of people with the right skill sets to understand not only the complex legal environment, but also the complex science that we're trying to legislate and regulate around. So this is something that we're seeing some changes, but has been a big barrier that we noted. And then finally, in organization and strategy, a barrier that I've called the quarterly reports, which really refers to the short-term financial view that companies in the United States tend to be beholden to. There's actually companies here have to adhere to the law of shareholder primacy, which essentially means that a company must maximize returns to its shareholders by law, and that needs to be the first and foremost priority. And they have to put out quarterly reports showing this progress. And with sustainability, investments either in technology or in lobbying, these tend to be investments that have a much longer return on investment, that you'll see years down the line. And when you have that tension between the short-term financial health and the long-term financial health, this can be a big barrier if the company is not oriented in the right way. So then the next bucket, intermediaries, you'll see sort of the teal green at the bottom there. There's only one barrier in there, but it's a big and important one. I'm sure you'll hear lots about it throughout this discussion, but that is trade associations. And many companies belong to many different trade associations. And this is a way for their interests to be represented to Congress and, at the state level as well. And they tend to be, especially the large multi-sector trade associations, tend to have a fairly anti-climate view and have a long history of working against climate policy. And so companies might not even be aware, if they belong to a trade association, to have their interests advanced on other topics that they care about. They might not even realize where their money is going and what their money is helping enable, or in this scenario, what it's helping to prevent, which is progress on climate policy. So that's a really big one. And finally, there is the policy context, which is looking outside of the company, things that aren't necessarily under their direct control, though we'll talk about strategies. And the first one here is backlash. There really is this fear and a real occurrence of backlash when companies speak out on something that is seen to be very polarizing as climate change. There can be backlash from consumers and customers, but also from politicians. And we have seen this play out in the past, and we're seeing it play out now around other topics like voter suppression laws. When companies speak up, there has been this backlash. So there is a fear there, and of course it can work both ways. Backlash for not stepping up, and we're seeing a lot more of that as well. But this is certainly a barrier to be aware of. And finally, just the political winds. We have an administration right now that is very keen to pass climate policy, but this has not been the case in the former administration. And if there's not an active bill moving on the Hill, a lot of companies have this view that they don't have to engage, that there's no role for them to play, when really the opposite is true, that we need that political momentum to get to the place where we have a viable bill that can be lobbied even harder on. So hopefully that is a good orientation. I'll ask Haley to post a link in the chat for anyone who wants to go to a quick summary article just to follow along on what these barriers are. But now I'd love to bring in our speakers, who hopefully you can see on your screen here now. We have a great group of folks. First, I'll invite in Bill Weil, and he is most recently the founder and executive director of Climate Voice, which is focused on the students and the current and future talent to really drive companies to be better actors, to go all in on climate change, both in their internal operations and when it comes to policy. And he has lots of experience as a lead sustainability actor, both at Google and director of sustainability at Facebook. So he can share both, an outside inside perspective with us today. So really excited to have Bill. Next, I'll invite in Christina Herman, and she is the Program Director for Climate and Environmental Justice at the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. And she has decades of work at the intersection of human rights and sustainable development, and right now is very concentrated and at the leading edge of investors who are examining how companies lobby on climate change and how to account for that. So we're excited to have her perspective with us today. And then finally, we have Hugh Welsh, who is the President and General Counsel of DSM North America. And Hugh has been a long-standing, outspoken voice on the need for companies to practice good climate lobbying, to really step up. And he himself has been carrying that out in his role at his own organization. So it'll be great to hear directly from someone in the thick of it. With that, welcome all. I'm excited to get things started, and let's go ahead and start by looking inside a company. And Bill, I'll go ahead and invite you to kick us off looking at what goes on in companies' organizational structures. It's a barrier that I find to be one of the most prominent myself in the research I've done, but would love to hear from you on what's happening inside a company that's causing trouble.
Sure, and thanks for having me. Really delighted to be here. People tend to think of companies sometimes in a cartoonish way, that someone makes a decision, pushes it down to the people underneath them, they execute. But the truth is, large companies, at least, are big, complicated beasts with many different organizations that have to collaborate on any kind of complicated issue. And deciding, for example, whether to lobby or exert political influence on an issue like climate is something that ends up being decided by the sustainability team, the legal team, the government affairs team, the marketing team, the comms team, probably a few others. Finance might weigh in because there could be political implications related to tax if you weigh in on something over here. So sustainability teams are often driving the issue of, should we weigh in on a given political issue? But they typically work in large companies, and most companies today, by influence, not by power. They don't directly control these decisions. The decision to weigh in on Capitol Hill is ultimately, the gatekeeper is the government affairs team. Mm-hmm. And most companies don't have a mandate from the board or the C-suite to lean into policy of any sort unless it directly affects their business. So in my experience, both inside Google and Facebook, and talking to peers at probably hundreds of other companies at this point, if a policy issue affects the company's business, companies have to weigh in. But otherwise, they evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, and factors that directly affect the company, all the barriers that you listed, short-term versus long-term thinking, fear of backlash, and so on, tend to win out. So organizationally, without a mandate from the top, all of these barriers tend to pop up and often result in that corporate intent you put on the left of your chart getting blocked before it gets over to the right and actually results in lobbying.
Great. Thanks, Bill. And Hugh, interested in your perspective, being inside a company yourself, would love to hear how you're organized and what you've seen in peers in terms of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, and Bill is spot on. I mean, traditionally, this function sits in a corporate sustainability group, which had always been, I think until the recent past, really part of like a communications or public relations team. And every once in a while, you pull the CEO out to make a pledge or sign a petition, and then back in the box, and we go back to ordinary business. And it never really trickled down to the different business leads, functions, operations in the organization to do anything about it. It was always, well, that sustainability group over there in headquarters, they got it covered. There'll be a nice brochure, and hey, look, we're special. We have an integrated annual report. What more can we do? And I know that we learned in DSM as we went through that sort of evolutionary process that if we actually wanted to get anything done, there was a lot more we could do. And one thing that worked really well in getting this sort of trickle down effect from the C-suite and the sustainability group was tying compensation to sustainability results. And for our executives, for 10 years now, the executives in our company, half of their short-term and long-term comp is tied to us reaching our sustainability targets. And that's a great way to get everybody's attention. And when they're giving me feedback on what they want me to talk about in Washington, it now has a little higher preference on the list. Another thing that's worked really well is taking that corporate sustainability group that was, again, at arm's length in many respects from the running business of the company, and taking the lead and making them part of the management team. And it was just a couple of years ago in DSM, we took the head of our sustainability group and made them part of our global leadership team. And that actually made a big difference, because now in all of our global leadership meetings, there was that voice of, what are we doing on climate in this geography? What are we doing on water resources in this other geography? And it really just kept putting it in front of our face, in front of our face, in front of our face, and made us want to do something. And the last that I'll leave you with is, you have to embed these things in your actual strategy. I mean, you can't just have a running pick list of sustainability targets that you want the company to reach. And it helps us a great deal, because our strategies around climate is improve, enable, advocate. And so we're like many companies, working to improve our own operations when it comes to sustainability and climate related matters. And that's great. And I think that's pretty standard now in the industry. We also move to enable our customers to reach their targets, right? And that's going to come in the form of developing new products, new services, new outreach, helping them reduce their carbon footprint, et cetera. But I think really what differentiates us is part of our strategy, we're going to advocate. And so we've made the conscious decision up front to make the resources available, to leverage our political capital for more than sort of those, I'll call them very tactical, very in the moment type activities that we engage with, especially in Washington. And so, as you mentioned, Amy, for years I've been advocating for climate, and I always get a lot of curious looks from other executives and other companies, like, why is you doing this? It just makes no sense, And it was because of this part of our strategic direction was, if we're genuine about this, if we're authentic about what we're saying, then we need to make these resources available to advocate as well.
Yeah, Hugh, that's really great insight. I loved what you said about tying executive compensation. That's something I've heard a lot as well, of just making sure that those incentives are in place and getting that direction from leadership down. So it's really exciting to hear what steps DSM has taken. And Christine, I'm curious from your perspective as an investor, what have you seen going on inside companies, and any changes that you've seen for what works best and where there's a struggle?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I want to first start out by just talking about the fact that climate, is a material risk for both companies and investors. There was a 2020 survey of 439 institutional investors, which included, pensions, mutual funds, banks, and insurers, and over half are already integrating climate risk into their investment processes. And 91% fully expect climate risks to be financially material to their investments in 5 years. I mean, everybody's heard Larry Fink's, announcements, pronouncements on the importance of the really fundamental importance of climate risk. And companies get that too. I mean, there are over 1,000 companies signed up on the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I mean, I think inside companies, Yeah, the idea of tying executive compensation is spot on. That's something we talk to a lot of companies about. Clearly, the incentives really matter. And I think board responsibility also, especially on this issue of climate lobbying, because it is something that really obviously is very important to the sustainability team. But unless you have that, like it reminds me of what the Biden administration has set up, sort of all of government approach. You need an all of company approach to dealing with climate, because it's a huge threat to the economy, to individual companies, and that's why investors are so, particularly long-term investors, are really concerned about it. So.
Yeah, I love what you said about an all of company approach. I think that's a very good metaphor, or even just direct advice on how companies should be approaching this. And kind of continuing along the internal challenges, maybe combining the barriers of having competing priorities and having these knowledge gaps. Hugh, I'll pass things back to you, and maybe if you want to share how you navigate having different priorities jockeying for top spot at DSM, and how do you fit climate into that one of those top priority slots?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting dilemma. I mean, even for a company like DSM, which I think of as pretty progressive on the issue of climate and sustainability, it's really, really a tough dilemma. And, if you think about it, and I have this conversation with our business leaders, about 35% of the decisions that are available to business leaders to steer their business are made by the government. And so you have to engage, right? You have to find a way to engage with the government on all these different issues. And that engagement comes in the form of direct engagement, which would be lobbying, the use of political action committees, which we don't do. I can talk about that as well, or through your trade associations, which is another barrier we'll discuss later. But it's a big challenge when you only have a limited amount of time or a limited amount of budget if you have a government relations group, to say to them, you need to focus on climate even when there's not an ask in Washington speak. You need to focus on climate even when there's not a bill pending that's either creating an opportunity or putting up a potential roadblock. And it's a challenging thing to do, because like the finance group, like the marketing teams, like the sales teams, the government affairs professionals or your retained lobbyists are working on a quarter-to-quarter basis as well. And they want to deliver against what's the latest tariff harmonization bill that I can weigh in on to help protect my business. What is the latest tax treaty coming out of Treasury that I need to engage on? I need to talk to my representative about the appropriations that are coming up through the Ag Committee. And when you try to reach them and say, but you also need to go there and talk about the importance of climate and how we need, they look at you like you have two heads. They're like, you want me to talk about that? We have this trade bill, we have this tax bill, we have new bills coming out with appropriations that our competitors are leaning hard into. It's a challenge, but as Christina said, this is a existential threat to the business. And if you don't, then you're not protecting the business. And so, for our company, it's a little bit easier, I think, than some. I mean, we're a Dutch headquartered company. I had to actually, help the company understand what government relations was all about, because engaging with elected officials here in the United States is very different than other parts of the world. But they've always sensed the importance of, if you have a voice, you have to give priority to the issues that are important to our company, and it's beyond the bottom line. Although climate, of course, is very impactful to the bottom line. And I've had to engage with, I would say, my business leaders here to help them understand the importance. And one I know we like tips. I'll give you one tip and trick that I like to use here. Is I hold one of our leadership team meetings every year in Washington. And I break the team up into groups, and these are all the leaders of the different business units in North America. And I take them up on the Hill to lobby about climate. And for many of them, it's their first experience engaging directly with an elected official. I think it's an important development opportunity for them. But after they do it, they've become converted. You can see the soul to Paul conversion take place. They begin to completely understand the importance of government relations and engaging with elected officials. And they understand that the issue of climate is one that resonates with Republicans and Democrats alike right now, and that they have an audience for those conversations, even when there's not a specific ask. So those dilemmas are real. It's a huge barrier in companies, but it's not one that can't be overcome by engagement.
Mhm. Yeah, that's some great stories you shared there, Hugh. And I think it's you mentioned being it coming from a Dutch company, the situation being different there than the U.S. context, and that this is really hard. So I'm wondering, Bill, um, if you have some experiences to share being very involved, in the U.S. tech scene, what you've seen playing out in those companies, or what you're seeing now from your position at Climate Voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think many large companies are lobbying on climate some these days. The problem is they're not doing it enough. It tends to be tactical, it tends to be reactive. A bill shows up, they evaluate, should we engage? Occasionally they do. They are not treating it as a strategic, as existential issue. And I think many of them in the public rhetoric on climate talk about it that way. It's not the way it plays out in the way they use their influence. And I think it's because of organizational structural issues that we talked about. It's because of competing priorities, the short-term fears about risk, government affairs, legal and comms. I've had people in those teams in various companies describe their job as avoiding risk. That's number one. And anything that creates risk without direct near-term benefit is not something they jump on. They try to avoid it. In engaging on climate policy, we'll get into political backlash and other backlash. It does create some risk. And for many companies, there is little direct benefit. We talked about, Hugh and Christina talked about the risk climate poses economically. Long-term, it's a huge systemic risk. I think many companies don't see a very big risk to their business in the near to medium term. So when they evaluate and manage their risk, they think, well, we're doing okay. So why should we weigh in on this? And the problem is, given the systemic risk, and given, Amy, you alluded to the powerful forces who have been for decades now pushing to, delay, weaken, stop climate policy. I think you were overly tactful. The fossil fuel companies have been really on the wrong side of this issue by and large for years. Some of that is beginning to shift, which is great. But given the very powerful voices on the other side, for companies to stay silent, that silence is not neutrality. It really is complicity with those who would like to perpetuate the status quo. And that drives systemic risk for all of us. So, the difficulty is getting, I think I love the way Hugh described it, that, most companies are certainly, as you said, very focused on their own operations, improving their own operations. Some are working to enable their customers or working to improve their supply chain. Very few really have as a strategic priority to advocate. And I think having that as a corporate priority then allows you, the kinds of things you talked about. I love the idea of taking your leadership team to Capitol Hill or a state capitol, getting them to feel like they own it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just someone else's job. I think is really critical, but that's not going to happen if it's not a corporate priority.
Yeah, Bill, I think you touched a lot on risk and how that's conceived of, how that plays out within a company. And I'd love to hear, Christina, from your perspective. This is something that, as an investor, I'm sure is something you deal with day in and day out, of trying to determine what risk you hold as an investor. And I'd be curious, what are you seeing from companies? Are they starting to integrate this big systemic risk into their own financial assessments? Are you seeing any trends here of companies and how they perceive a risk when it comes to climate?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was just thinking when Bill was talking, for investors, direct and indirect lobbying that's misaligned with science-based climate policies is an investment risk. And investors have made that very clear. in letters. I mean, it started in Europe with engagements with corporations there. In the fall of 2019, 200 institutional investors with a combined $6.5 trillion in assets under management sent a letter to 47 of the largest US publicly traded corporations to, specifically to align their lobbying with the Paris Agreement, and warning that those lobbying efforts inconsistent with those goals are an investment risk. So clearly investors get it. And we've been talking to companies. There were 11 resolutions filed in the last year. Quite a few of those were withdrawn for agreement with companies. But those that did go to a vote, of the 6, 5 won high majority votes. Over 76% at Norfolk Southern, over 63% at ExxonMobil. Chevron got a majority vote last year. Delta, there were others. And so it's clear where investors are standing. You asked about companies. I think, companies have been affected by climate impacts for a while now. I mean, the flooding in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand, shut down the auto industry in I think it was 2012 or 2014. And, we're seeing wildfires, droughts, stationary hurricanes that are dumping, huge amounts of water on cities. The heat dome. I mean, all of these are climate exacerbated, natural phenomenon that are really harmful economically to companies and their extended supply chains. So we are seeing companies certainly respond. I mean, the adoption of science-based targets and those commitments, it has been really telling. And again, investors with the latest, I don't know if you saw the AGM at ExxonMobil, but 3 board members, put in by engine number 1 and other backed by pension funds who are really frustrated with the company and their slow action in responding to, and coming up with any transition plans that are meaningful. This is a huge issue for the investor community. And I would say a majority of assets under professional management are, very much lined up on this issue. So it's really, so companies can take action on climate. And I think you've said this, but what we really need to be able to address the climate crisis successfully is to have, good policy in place. And without that, we're not going to get where we need to go with individual action as well, planned and implemented as that can be. So, yeah. And I mean, I just want to say that, the Ceres Bicep Network has been very active and a really, really important development. They've been active on Capitol Hill. We need many, many more companies, really prioritizing this on Capitol Hill and aligning their trade association memberships, with their own climate goals. It's critical.
Thank you, Christina. Speaking of trade associations, you were talking about, from the investor perspective, all of this pressure on individual companies. And one of the big trends, something that I myself and my colleagues at WRI and at many other NGOs are really focused on right now, are the role of trade associations. And Bill, you kind of were, very direct, which I appreciate that. This has been a big problem over the years. These massive trade associations that have millions of dollars at their command every year and a long history with politicians. There's really been this drive to, to change what trade associations are doing. And we've seen folks like Hugh as an individual company, you can take steps to be a good lobbyist internally through DSM. But when it comes to trade associations that you hold membership in, there's not as much control being one company, one guy, to actually switch what that lobbying looks like and to really push for climate change. And one of the things that I found working with companies in this space is just a real difficulty getting trade associations to shift at the same pace that many of their members are. You know, there's some education that is starting to pick up, trying to get both trade association staff and company members more familiar with some of the climate policy mechanisms out there, trying to get more comfortable with what might be coming down the line, but getting comfortable with the idea of something as a far cry from being a vocal champion of the policies we need. You know, we've seen a number of the big U.S. trade associations come out recently and say either directly that they support a price on carbon, or more vaguely that they support the idea of a market mechanism. But this is not translating to actual lobbying to get something like that passed. So Hugh, I'm wondering if you could share some of your experiences with the trade association complex and how you go about that and trying to get them better aligned.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. And I don't think most people realize it working in corporations, but their biggest channel for political influence isn't through their PAC or through their CEO or through their direct lobbyists. It's through their trade associations. It's that aggregated political capital and candidly financial capital that really, really has tremendous amount of influence in Washington, D.C. So it's not coincidental that you see all of these big trade associations headquartered in Washington, D.C. And, for our company, we decided that we were going to take a hard look at all of the different trade associations that we belong to around the world. And so a number of years ago, we did an inventory of all the different trade associations. And we have a pretty diverse business. So there were hundreds of them that we were members of, from little tiny, very specific issue ones like on enzymes to, of course, the large, very impactful trade associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And in that inventory, we looked to see what their climate policy was. Did they have one that was beneficial to advocating in support of climate mitigation solutions? Were they adversarial or were they neutral? And if they were beneficial, great, we'll stick with it. If they're neutral, we're going to work to try to get them to be climate advocates, right? That's a way for us to amplify our own voice and use that leverage that a trade association represents when advocating for the climate mitigation actions. We had two choices. We either quit or we worked hard to try to influence the position that trade association was going to take and hopefully be successful. So how did it bear out? Well, there were, of course, many of them that we chose to leave, many of them that we had some success in changing their direction. Here in the United States, I was on the board of directors of a very big, very, very big trade association. And at a board meeting, I asked, can we put a commission together to look at climate change and whether or not we as an organization can play a role in advocating for climate solutions? And it was a resounding no. And I resigned that board that day. And it was at the time it was challenging within DSM because I had a business constituency that felt that our membership in that trade association was super important. And I had to lay out to them, it might be, but there are other ways for us to achieve those goals and not have to compromise our mission, vision, and goals with respect to climate. Another one, and I think a lot of folks are familiar with, is U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right? Arguably the most powerful trade association, not just in the United States, but probably the world, and had a very long and storied history of opposing climate-related legislation in many different forms, either directly through litigation and et cetera. And like many other big companies, we got letters from members of the Senate. We got letters from organizations, not WRI, but like WRI, that were telling us we needed to quit the chamber because of their climate policy. And exercising our strategy, we worked with a number of different organizations, a number of different chamber members, to put together a climate solutions working group to try to convince the chamber to change its position. And that group started out small, like 4 or 5, but quickly built up some momentum, even during the last administration, which wasn't always easy. And we managed to have some success. And I have to applaud the chamber. I have to applaud Suzanne Clark, because they have begun to pivot to being not opposed to climate-related legislation or imposing litigation to stop any climate-related legislation. They've, in many respects, opened the door for another whole side of Congress on the Republican side to now speak out openly about climate matters without fear of being primaried these are I would call them tectonic shifts in the chamber policy-wise. Now, are they durable? We'll see. Is it just a reaction to this administration? I don't know. But maybe I'm too simple. Maybe I'm too naive. I'm going to take them at their word for now and try to work with them to drive the change that I think we're all advocating for here today. And they do within the chamber have a climate task force that they stood up about 2 years ago, which is doing actual work in trying to drive some legislative solutions. So I remain encouraged, but I would tell everyone, you really need to do an inventory of the trade associations you belong to, so you understand what position your proxies are taking in Washington, not just from an opportunity perspective, but from a risk perspective, because the world is becoming increasingly transparent. And if you belong to trade associations or engage in political giving, that is counter to the narrative your CEO is saying, or your sustainability group, you're going to find yourself in a whole lot of trouble really quick. Some of you may be familiar with what happened to Toyota just this week. I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Hugh. Christina, I'm wondering, when you're, from the investor perspective, what do you do with trade associations? How do you look at that?
Well, I really wanted to jump in. I loved what Hugh was talking about, because that's exactly what we're asking companies to do. So, our proposals, proposals that go to a vote are advisory, and they usually ask for reports because we're limited in what we can do. We can't micromanage, and we don't want to micromanage any of the companies we own. We do want to have meaningful conversations with them about this. So this, we've been asking companies a suite of things on this issue. So one is, align your lobbying positions with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And for us, that means really trying to stay at 1.5, because the report that the UNFCCC did a couple of years ago really got everybody's attention. The impacts from even a 2-degree rise are really going to be devastating. And we're at 1 degree now, and look what's going on. So that's, key, align. And then, ramp up. You were talking earlier about making this, a key priority for companies. We have to bring the long-term to today. We have to take that view that, it's happening it's going to happen in the future. What we're loading into the system now is going to determine what our children are going to live with and what we're going to live with in our old age. So it's really, really important what companies do now. And we need to take action now. So and then on the trade association front, absolutely, assess your trade association memberships. First of all, please disclose them, because we don't always know. There's no requirement that companies need to say what trade associations they're members of. And then assess them for their alignment with Paris, exactly what DSM has done. And then report out on that. If you're in disagreement, we're not saying you have to leave. I mean, in some cases, we do think it's wise. Alec and a few others, and Tim Smith is on this webinar listening, and he's led work on that for well over a decade, that in climate lobbying and lobbying disclosure by companies. It's very important. But assess for alignment. And then if you're in disagreement, work to change it, work internally. Love what Hugh's been doing with others inside the chamber. And then, if you're in disagreement with them, state that, because that is avoiding reputational risk on your part. It's really important that you not be caught in this, sort of trap of saying one thing on your website and then belonging to a trade association that's saying something quite different, and often, working against your own interests as a company. So if you have a science-based target as a company, you really need strong climate policy to help you get there. That is wind in your sails. And I would really urge all the companies on this webinar who hear it to join that group inside the chamber and really work for the kinds of changes in the policy positions that the chamber adopts, because I think it's been, I'll just call it out. I mean, the oil and gas industry is very interested in maintaining, a certain set of policies. And that is not in everybody else's interest. So I think that's where, we've sort of come to the point where we're talking about the economy as a whole and people. And I noticed in the chat, there's a lot of discussion of stakeholders. We feel very strongly that the impacts of companies on communities really needs to be taken into consideration in their planning. And climate policy is not just about removal of greenhouse gas emissions from, greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It's really about ensuring a just transition, that we have an opportunity here to create a healthier and more equitable economy for people. And I would love to see that be part of the conversation as well.
Thanks, Christina. I'll just encourage everyone, we're 7 minutes out. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and pop them in the Q&A. But waiting for those to come in, Bill, I know that you work closely on this trade association issue as well, and might have, slightly different perspective than some of than Christina or Hugh here, but also looking at the time, if you want to talk at all about backlash as well and anything you've experienced there, I'll just, I'll open things to you.
Sure. I think, Christina and Hugh and you, Amy, have all talked about the historical positions of major trade associations. Influence Map, and I think WRI as well, have both published analyses really showing the negative role of the U.S. Chamber, the National Association of Manufacturers, Business Europe, and others. It's not just a U.S. issue. The role they played in blocking, delaying, weakening climate-related policies. We are beginning to see change, I would say, in at least the top-level messaging from some of these organizations. The question is, in my mind, will it translate to a real change in how they approach individual binding policies? Because if they say we believe in Paris, but then they fight the methane rule, or they fight a clean energy standard or clean building standards, they may have seemingly legitimate reasons for doing that, but we don't have the time to spend another 10 years finding something that somehow satisfies everybody. We have to be willing to compromise, and politics is the art of the possible. And we need to change what's possible. I think what Hugh and some other leaders are doing, and the chamber's shift, I think, are changing what's possible, but we need to move really fast. In terms of backlash, I think companies worry about backlash from several fronts, from investors, from their customers, from politicians, and the kinds of policies that those politicians might enact, and their workforce, their talent pool. Their overall reputation affects all of these. And in terms of real impact on their business, I think many large companies have been most worried about backlash from customers and from politicians. If we take a strong stand for policy that might mean we burn a lot less oil and gas, and oil and gas companies are major customers, that's a problem. That's why you don't see a lot of major banks, for example, I think, taking strong stands in favor of really bold climate policies. Same for major consulting firms. They all make a lot of money off oil and gas companies. And they worry about politicians if they take a strong stand on something like climate that might be good for all of us in the long term, but that upset some politician who, to Hugh's point about a significant percentage of their business is at regulatory risk, and some politician denies them a tax break or does something else that hurts their business. That hurts them today. And so the natural thing, I think, for many companies has been to say, we'll avoid that risk for now, we'll kick the can down the road. The problem is we're running out of road to kick the can down. The other place, though, that I think most companies haven't paid real attention to on this is their talent pool. And that's where I think we are seeing a real seismic shift. beginning to happen. So we at Climate Voice are educating and engaging corporate workforces, current employees, also students as their talent pool they're going to be hiring from, to understand how important lobbying is. To Hugh's point, he had to educate his Dutch colleagues about how political, influence government affairs works in the US. Most people in the US and elsewhere don't really understand how companies operate on this. And as we educate them, we can just see the light bulb going off and they realize, wow, the fossil fuel industry is using their enormous influence. Mm-hmm. Other companies are sitting back and mostly watching the show, and the show's getting kind of ugly. And they are beginning to speak up, employees and students, and call on companies to get off the sidelines and play an active role in driving the change we need. We're doing that at Climate Voice. There's a group of student groups called Change the Chamber that is pushing companies to either change the chamber or get out of it. And I think the change we've seen is good. We need to see more. But those kinds of pressures take this long-term systemic risk and turn it into a near-term business risk if companies continue to stay on the sidelines.
Thanks, Bill. And with just one minute left here, I want to give all of you a chance to kind of wrap up final thoughts. But for myself, I promised at the beginning of this that that you'd come away with an idea for next steps and to follow through. I'll recommend that everyone here today, if you're part of the company, don't delay and start looking at what barriers apply to your company. They don't all fall equally depending on what industry you're in or what your internal setup. They might apply in different ways, but start taking a look at that and start actually outlining where the big pain points are and write a plan for yourself. Whether you're in management or you're not, who do you need to start talking to? What policies do you need to enact? What's the climate risk assessment that you need to conduct to connect with your investors and really push this through the entire corporation? There's really no time to lose. So we're working with companies ourselves at WRI to do an analysis of how these barriers apply to them. So if you're interested, please do reach out. But in any event, don't waste time on this. Christina, why don't I pass into you for just a quick final?
Sure. Yeah, no, so I would just say investors really want to work with their companies on this. There is there's a set of investor expectations that's been articulated. Chronos Sustainability in the UK is developing a benchmarking process, so companies will be benchmarked on this. There's clear guidance from the B team on how to assess your trade associations and report on that. So I would really commend that to you. But we're looking forward to engaging a lot more companies in this next season on this set of issues. So yeah, thanks.
Bill, how about you?
I think there are a couple of pieces of advice I would give. One, I get asked a lot, well, which policies should we lobby on? And I think that the problem is there isn't a single one. It's not just a price on carbon. There are a bunch of different policies that we need. And the answer is you need to make it a priority and devote the staff and the time to actually dig in and understand what's going on and what's on the table and help make what seems politically possible actually happen. But that really means lobbying like you mean it, not just making high-level statements and doing photo ops and then, as Hugh said, going back to your box, but really getting there, use your influence, carrots and sticks, to drive change. Right now, if companies are interested in stepping up, there's a clean energy standard that's I believe still potentially part of the infrastructure bill that's in Congress. And some companies are speaking up on it. I think DSM has, and we need more. This is, I think, in terms of the current bill, one of the most important things to keep in there. And too few companies are speaking up at the moment. We need many more. So Ceres is organizing a letter. I would say sign that letter, call your senators and representatives. I put a link to our policy guide for business leaders that we published last year, revised this spring. It's only 8 pages, so it's a quick read. I would encourage people to read it and really think about how to make this a priority, because this is where the puck is going. You want to go there, not where it is today.
Thanks, Bill. And I know we're just a few minutes over time, but Hugh, last word to you.
I'd like to thank you and Elliot for the report. It's fantastic. Perhaps it's my, somewhat naive, highly optimistic, highly energetic approach, but I don't see it as 7 barriers. I see them as 7 opportunities, a roadmap on how to engage with your company to unleash its tremendous potential to drive change. I think when we look over the course of American history, when big change happens, it's because the private sector steps up and demands that its elected officials, its trade associations, its customers and suppliers act. And we're in a position right now, we have no more time left. We have no more time left to debate, we have to act. And so use those 7 barriers, I call them opportunities, as a roadmap to get your company to unleash its full potential, from its CEO, through its trade associations, through its employees, through its customers, suppliers, and other stakeholders, to drive the action we need to see on climate right now.
Thanks, Hugh. I love the 7 opportunities. Maybe that's part 2 of this paper. But big thank you to you, Hugh, and Bill and Christina for being here. This is such an engaging conversation, and I hope that everyone in the audience enjoyed this as well. We'll go ahead and end things here, but thanks all, and have a great rest of your day.